This is Gail Morgan welcoming you to the Libertarian Counterpoint. Now, your host, James Just.
Good evening and welcome to Libertarian Counterpoint. With me is Mr. Richard Fields. Richard, it's been a busy last couple weeks, and we've had some mixed rulings on the Supreme Court, and so there's some interesting perspectives on free speech and how it's threats or not threats. I was kind of wondering what you had to say about that this week.
Well, yeah, you mentioned the Supreme Court and free speech, and that just leads right into, hi, this is Richard Fields with this week's report from the fields. Boomers and our children are the only generations in recent history to have had the privilege of living in an era of mostly free and unrestricted free speech. Prior to the internet and the email communications and social media platforms it spawned, free speech and free press had what Hillary Clinton longingly called gatekeepers. They were the New York Times, the Washington Post, ABC, NBC, CBS, the Associated Press, and toward the end of that period, Fox. And that was it. They controlled the dissemination of, quote, news, unquote, and in order to get news unfiltered by the gatekeepers, one had to subscribe to small circulation magazines, financial newsletters, and things like that. When internet communications arrived on the scene in the 1990s, freedom of speech actually began to flourish, gradually at first and then with gusto. Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter were largely uncensored and unfiltered. Anyone with a camera on their computer or on their phone could become a self-styled expert on something or other on YouTube. Everyone had equal access. The internet did not care what one said or thought. They were happy to sell advertising clicks on anything and everything. At the same time, mostly conservative talk radio came into its own. In retrospect, it's clear that this unprecedented free speech brought about the end of the screening of political candidates by the state, deep state intelligence agencies, middle state bureaucracies, and the various shallow state government private sector partnerships, exemplified by the military-industrial, education, healthcare, etc. complexes. As H.L. Mencken once said, in a democracy, the people get what they want, good and hard. In 2016, we got Donald J. Trump. The last deep state approved presidential candidate was Barack Obama. It wasn't Trump. Ever since, the middle, the deep, and the shallow state have been laboring industriously to make sure that never happens again. The social media companies have all, except X under Elon Musk, been strong-armed into amplifying only state-approved narratives. The strong-arm technique is extortion, pure and simple, as in, that sure is a profitable social media site you have there. You sure wouldn't want to lose it, would you? The implicit threats include crippling regulations up to and including getting rid of Section 230, which shields social media companies from liability stemming from inflammatory and libelous claims their users might post. The final two nails in the coffin are the Supreme Court's dismissal of Murphy versus Missouri because of lack of standing, and the appointment of retired U.S. General, Director of National Security Agency, and Chief of the Central Security Service, Paul Nakasone, to the board of OpenAI, as well as to its Safety and Security Committee. The Supreme Court decision means the weekend with Biden administration or its successor can continue its blatant censorship of social media to make sure no one can be seen or heard stepping over the official government narrative. Right now, that means the Democratic Party narrative, since they control the executive branch of government. Sure, a party with standing can come back later and give the Supreme Court an opportunity to rule that this kind of media censorship is unconstitutional, but it won't happen before this year's election. OpenAI is the company behind ChatGPT. For the uninitiated, ChatGPT is the public-facing tool of artificial intelligence. In highly simplified terms, when given a prompt or a question, ChatGPT or other AI services will scour the publicly available information stored in the cloud to come up with a response to a prompt or answer to a question. It's called artificial intelligence, but it's really just a summary of groupthink. You may have noticed that internet searches now come up with these groupthink summaries rather than links to original sources. An unrepentant deep state cretin is now a gatekeeper on whatever gets onto the cloud, or at least what ChatGPT can draw from the cloud. You can bet that there will not be a trace of anything that contradicts the deep state narrative. So get ready to say goodbye to anything approaching objectivity when you do an internet search. We're back to the era of Walter Cronkite when it comes to freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And that's the way it is. I'm Richard Fields, and that's this week's Report from the Fields.
You know, that's interesting. You talk about the AI thing, because these last few weeks, since ChatGPT became a thing, right? I've been using the Bing version of ChatGPT to write show descriptions for our sister podcast, the Knuckleheads of Liberty, right? And the last few weeks, I've been posting stuff in, and sorry, we can't answer that topic. It's time to move on.
Exactly. It's not politically correct. If it doesn't fit the narrative, forget about it. And that's just the title. They'll look at the text as well. I mean, it's totally censoring everything that doesn't fit the official Reid Democratic Party controlled at this time government narrative. And the thing about it is, Democrats shouldn't cheer about that, because at some point the Republicans will control that narrative, and they'll do exactly the same thing, except fitting narratives.
Of course they will, because they all fight for the same team, right? That's the ultimate. Yeah. They all fight for call them the elites, call them the deep state, call it whatever euphemism you want to slap onto it. It's ultimately they all work for themselves. So speaking about someone who works for themselves, Richard, Gavin Newsom and the Democrats here in California, they were trying to undercut what proposition was it? The new proposition. There's a state on
47.
Yeah, 40. There's a proposition to reform Prop 47, right? And so they were trying to come up with a slate of retail theft reform bills in the California legislature. But they were going to put poison pills on them, that if this new proposition passed, then these bills would no longer be in effect. And so eventually, I guess it was so brazen that they backed out of it the last minute. But the Democrats here in California manipulate the electoral system so blatantly while sitting around here talking about protecting democracy. It's almost amazing that they can sit there and open their mouths. Sometimes I'm just speechless, Richard. I'm literally speechless on.
Well, like I mentioned earlier, H.L. Mencken, writing back in the 1930s, got it right. Democracy is that form of government which gets the public exactly what it wants, good and hard. And we're going to get what we say we want, but probably have some second thoughts about it, because some of these initiatives don't get on the ballot because the politicians that we voted for, overwhelmingly in the case of Gavin Newsom, say, well, no, that's not something that the public should be allowed to think about, much less vote about.
Well, and this is the thing. If according to the article I linked to, emails linked to CBS News, Newsom's chief of staff met with the initiative's proponents to try to persuade them to withdraw the initiative and put it again next year, and then they help them try to pass it. So it's not like they even care about the initiative. The initiative's fine. We just don't want it this year.
Well, and we don't want to do anything that would interfere with the Newsom shadow campaign for president.
Yeah, that's what all this is really about, isn't it? Is Newsom's trying to despite his objective failure in California. I mean, how could anybody look at California and say the ruling party has done a half decent job? Is laughable.
And his often stated heartfelt support for voting for Joe Biden. I mean, it's so blatantly hypocritical and obvious what he's doing that it doesn't pass the smell test.
Yeah, I get tired of these political machinations here in California. The hypocrisy bothers me to no end. And so, actually here, Richard, we're going to move on. We're all over the place this week, Richard. Iran has a new president. And they called him, the article, MSN reported in, they called him a guarded reformist, but he is a quiet survivor. The article was pretty interesting. I actually sat down there, and the article is actually fairly interesting. Of course, you don't know how much of it is fluff and how much of it is, Well,
yeah, you have to understand the political situation in Iran. In Iran, they have a democracy. You can vote for whoever is on the ballot. And the key, of course, is whoever is on the ballot, because the supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei, or whatever he calls himself, has absolute veto power over anybody being on the ballot. And if you don't toe the line as far as the Muslim religious law, wearing the hijab, and supporting the Iranian foreign policy, including its death to Israel stance, and the whole ball of wax, if you don't pay a lip service to that, you won't get on the ballot. Now, this is a guy that understands how the system works. He's a doctor. He's been in various levels of government for a while now. He understands how it works, and he knows where that line is, where you cannot cross and still remain on the ballot for whatever you want to run for. Sort of like a more blatant version of the deep state. If you want to get on the ballot in the U.S., you have to do what the deep state thinks or wants. Same thing in Iran, except they're very blatant about it and very very open about it, and much more extreme. This guy has probably has very sympathies, very sympathetic to the West, very sympathetic to increasing civil liberties in Iran, especially for women, all of those things. But he can't say so. He has to campaign and let people read between the lines. And a majority of voters in Iran, I think, did read between the lines and say, we don't want the proponent of really hardline Islamist rule. We want somebody who's going to at least move in a reform direction. And that's what they got. We'll see how long he lasts and how effective he is in that role.
Yeah, because ultimately, like you said, he does what he's told to do by the Ayatollah. I mean, that's how the system works. But it is, I guess, I don't want to say heartening is probably the wrong word, but it's a sliver of hope, maybe.
It's a small step, and it's a baby step in the right direction. Have to admit that.
Yeah. All right. So these protesters, we're in the Middle East. We're going to move on to some Middle East protesters. The the pro-Palestinian protesters, the anti-Israeli protesters, however you want to qualify them. The students across the country, they created encampments in the studio in these universities, and a few of them, and we highlighted one in our prep for the show, but one of them at the University of Southern Florida, was it? Yeah, the University of South Florida in Tampa. Well, they were literally one class, one assignment away from graduation, and got expelled from school and didn't graduate.
Yeah,
because in an encampment. It wasn't. They didn't participate in just a protest, right? They encamped out and that kind of thing. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's a he said, she said as far as what this woman actually did, the student. The university says that she was accused her of firearms violations, carrying firearms, and she denies it. I don't know. I'm not sure, who actually knows the facts on that. But that's kind of a little bit beside the point, because when you have to look at this thing on two levels. what are the protesters, the pro-Palestinian protesters, protesting about? They're protesting in favor of Hamas, which is a hardline Muslim, very religious, at least in their rhetoric, faction in the Middle East, in Israel. And they carried out a very brutal attack against Israel back in October. Now, their grievances are real. Israel has not allowed them to self-govern in any really meaningful form. They make it really difficult for them to even survive in that narrow strip of land on the Israeli coast. But it's one of those things where the U.S. citizens in particular, really don't have a dog in the fight. We don't like what Hamas stands for or does. They are profoundly illiberal when it comes to civil liberties, economics, the whole ball of wax. We also don't like the way that Israel has kind of using military power, the point of a gun, forced them to succumb to whatever Israel wants. So there's bad on both sides, not a lot of good on either side, other than the fact that Israel is a successful nation state in terms of economics, at least, and the rest of those Arab countries not so much, or the Arab countries surrounding Israel not so much. So it's hard to find a hero in this story, and hard to find a reason, at least for me, why anybody would be protesting on either side, whether it's for Israel or for Hamas. This woman was protesting, and I think we have to, at least in principle, support her right to protest. But then there's a property rights or a contractual right on the part of Florida State University, which is, you want to come to our school, you have to follow our rules, and they have at least the contractual right to do that, if not the property right to say what can and what cannot happen on school premises. So it's a can of worms. And you have to also look at the fact that the protesters in favor of Hamas are probably funded and supported by leftist groups in the U.S. just to cause trouble.
Well, and remember, a few years ago, they were talking when this was happening to right-wing students, were getting kicked out of colleges and whatnot. They were calling it consequence culture. It wasn't cancel culture; it was consequence culture. Well, they wanted to stood up for something they believed in, and there's consequences to that. Personally, I think at some point they should mail her diploma and just move on with it. But but other than that, I like you said, a pox on both their houses, and I just have a rough time myself getting all personally worked up over the whole 9 yards. So, how's that for an end of that one?
How's that for a transition? Moving on.
Yeah. So we're going to move on from protests to camping bans, Richard. The Supreme Court has ruled that cities are allowed to ban camping on city property, right? Before, there had been some court ruling that said cities couldn't do that, couldn't ban camping if there wasn't enough beds or some weird, goofy, arbitrary set of rules that some judge came up with. Mm-hmm. And now the Supreme Court says if you want to ban camping, you can. You don't have to, you can. And so now there was a question here in Sacramento about, what does that mean for Sacramento? That's, well, it means whatever you want it to mean, you stinking dimwits. You don't have to change anything. You can't change anything. I don't understand what everybody's all worked up about for it. Nothing.
Well, people are worked up because homeless people are camping on their doorsteps, and people don't like that, and that's understandable. But this is an onion problem. There are multiple layers to this onion, the onion of homelessness. We would not have a homeless problem if we didn't regulate the housing market to death. If we didn't ban tiny homes, if we didn't have something like, 20 years ago, it was like $50,000 in government fees before you turned the first shovel of earth in building a new house. I'm sure it's more than that by now. If you were able to build as densely as you want, as the developer wants to do, all of these things contribute to a higher cost of housing, and it's mostly driven by NIMBY concerns, not in my backyard. I don't want to have a packed, a densely packed neighborhood. I don't want to have apartments across the street from me. I don't want to have low-cost housing anywhere near my front step. So what happens when you have very expensive housing? You have people who can't afford that expensive housing, left with very little else to do other than buy a tent and camp wherever they can find a place to pitch the tent. Now, that and that causes problems for the people who have property that's being camped on, whether it's a city or whether it's a business or whether it's your front yard.
Yeah, there's always been a certain level of homelessness. You can go back all the way to the days of, oh man, I'm forgetting my Greek philosophers, but you can go all the way to Greek philosophers, who was one of the famous Greek philosophers, was essentially a homeless man, right?
Yeah.
So there's always been some level of that. But what happened at least in places like California is you became so hard to stay on the economic ladder. If you were one of those people on the low ends of the economic ladder, and they just kept moving that thing higher, the low rungs of economic ladder are now so high, if you fall off, it's almost impossible to get back on.
Yeah, but the weather's nice, so people don't mind camping that much. I mean, that's a cynical way of looking at it, and I realize that, but that contributes to the issue. You don't have that kind of a homeless problem in Duluth, for instance.
Yeah, it's who wants
to go to California.
Who wants to go do that? Who wants to be homeless in something that's freezing cold? Even though apparently they do have homeless problems in Minnesota.
Oh yeah, they do. Just not as bad.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to go back to the Supreme Court here. Supreme Court ethics, and this is always funny how the Supreme Court ethics really always depends upon if the Supreme Court is ruling the way you like or not. But so the Supreme Court, now that the Supreme Court came out with a bunch of hard right rulings, which I'm going to use severe air quotes, hard right rulings, essentially, restricting the administrative state is now hard right. So go figure. So now there's ethics is what they're going to try to use to figure out some way to control the court. They're going to use ethics as the next wedge, right? Whether it's a way to stack the court, to gin up fear to stack the court, or whether it's going to use some way to put the court in control of Congress or the administrative state. They're going to try something.
I mean, there's two levels of ethics charges that are being made. One is the charges against Alito, which are essentially that he's flying the wrong symbolic flag at his beach house or at his house. He's blaming it on his wife, which seems like kind of a cheap cop-out. But nonetheless, that's the issue, whether or not he has the right to fly a flag with symbolic meaning. Or fly the flag upside down or whatever. To me, I don't think you lose your free speech rights when you are on the Supreme Court, or at least you shouldn't. But that's what they're trying to make happen. But the other issue is a little bit more problematical, and that is accepting free travel, which is what Clarence Thomas has been doing on behalf of Harlan Crow, a super wealthy billionaire that's a big Republican contributor, and has been giving Clarence Thomas free airplane rides to pretty much whatever vacation destination he wants to go on for quite some time now. That smells, and Thomas is not willing to recuse himself. I'm not sure if there's any cases where recusal would actually be an issue, but my guess is he's not going to recuse himself. He thinks, that's okay. There's no law that says I can't do that, but it sure does present a conflict of interest, or it doesn't pass the smell test.
No, what I want to point out is it didn't pass the smell test when Ginsburg was doing it as well. And
no,
there were a couple of them that have a history of it. Most of them kind of stay clear, but what was it? Ginsburg, the one that passed away, Ginsburg's friend, and Clarence Thomas. They all seem to have this relationship with individuals who are willing to fly them around. And whether there's any nefarious backings or reasons for that is hard for us to know. But
we don't know if there's a quid pro quo, but there certainly could be. But the real danger here, of course, is the current configuration of the Supreme Court is relatively, and I think I have to underscore the word relatively libertarian in its rulings. Chevron was a more or less libertarian ruling. The government or the ruling on presidential immunity, not so much. That ruling is probably anti-libertarian in terms of its import. And then you can take a look at some of the other rulings. The affirmative action ruling, fairly libertarian. But the real danger here is that the Democrats are going to use this. Just give them time. They're already talking about it. Going to use it to say, we need to pack the court, a la Franklin Delano Roosevelt back in the 1930s. In other words, increase the membership of the court while a Democrat is sitting as president, so he can appoint a new majority of liberals or
and do the exact same thing they're complaining about, which is And by the way, I'm not surprised about the immunity ruling. It's qualified. It's a qualified immunity case essentially, and of course they were going to rule that way.
Yeah.
It was. We've got a minute and a half, so I'm going to move down to MrBeast. Everybody's mad at MrBeast, Richard, because he had the nerve to build some houses for people. I'm
not sure. I watched the video. I've never heard of MrBeast before. I guess that tells me how unaware of things as popular media I am. But where does he get his money to build all these houses?
Making YouTube videos.
So he makes enough money on YouTube videos to build all those houses.
Yeah, YouTube videos and consultancy work and all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
Well, good for him. What's everyone bitching about?
He builds houses. He gets water to people. He does all these things, and people are mad at him because government should be doing that. It's really what they're upset about because the government should be building houses, and he's going, well, I know, but someone's got to do it. And
government should not be doing those things for the precise reason that we talk about endlessly on these shows.
Well, they're terrible at it because MrBeast can do it better, cheaper, and in the right places for the right people, and the governments clearly can't.
Yeah.
Despite all their billions of dollars spent, despite all their want tos and said hows and how tos and 5-point plans and 5-year plans and 13 points and whatever, all the BS they try to spread us, they fail all the time. All right. Anyway, Richard, we are out of time. Thank you for joining with me this week. Thank you all for watching. Have a good night, and please remember to love everybody.
Thank you, James. See you later.
This is Gail Morgan thanking you for watching the Libertarian Counterpoint each Thursday at 8 p.m. Channel 17 on Comcast, on YouTube